Welcome to Moon's Fairy Tales. Today, we journey into the mystical world of Middle-earth with Shadows of the Vanquished. Follow the legendary Galadriel, Lady of Lothlórien, as she sets out to hunt down the last traces of Sauron's lingering malice. What ancient secrets lie hidden in the dark corners of Middle-earth? What dangers await as she faces remnants of Morgoth's evil, and the betrayals of those she trusts? This is a tale of shadow, light, and sacrifice. Sit back, relax, and let the whispers of Middle-earth draw you in. Chapter 1: Echoes of the Past. The air of Lothlórien was still. A golden silence lingered, woven among the trees of Kara's Galadhon, as though the very leaves held their breath, waiting. High in her talon, Galadriel stood gazing into the distance, her sharp eyes piercing the horizon far beyond the familiar woods of her realm. Though Sauron had fallen, his tower broken and his servants scattered, something stirred. Deep within her, in the place where the light of the trees of Valinor still glowed faintly, she sensed it, an echo, faint yet undeniable, calling to her from the shadows. She closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. The familiar sense of Lothlórien filled her senses, the earth, the leaves, the quiet song of the elves. But these no longer brought her peace. A shadow had fallen across the beauty of her sanctuary, one that she alone could perceive. Evil does not simply fade, it lingers, like a stain on the very fabric of the world. She knew it well. She had felt it many times before, in the long ages of her life. And now, once more, it crept back. Lady Galadriel. The voice of Celeborn broke her reverie, soft yet firm, as he entered the talon. His silver hair shimmered faintly in the pale light, but his brow was furrowed with concern. She could see it in his eyes. He, too, had begun to sense that something was not right. There are whispers, he continued, stepping closer. Elves from the borders bring word of strange sightings. Lights in the east, beyond the edges of our land. Shadows in the night. The people are uneasy. Galadriel did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the unseen distance. She had already felt what Celeborn described, though in her heart, she had known it would come. Sauron was not gone, not truly. His physical form was shattered, but his malice, it persisted, like a wretched curse bound to the lands of Middle-earth. It could not be destroyed, only driven back for a time. Lothlórien still stands, she said at last, her voice low but resolute. But the world beyond stirs. Darkness does not end with a single victory. Celeborn frowned. You believe this to be his doing? She turned to face him, her expression grave. There are whispers, from the east. Places long forsaken by light. The lands of Run, the south. Old evils, forgotten by most, but not gone. Her gaze was intense, the weight of the ages visible in her eyes. Sauron sought power wherever it lay hidden. We defeated his armies, but his spirit lingers, drawn to the remnants of his dark work. Celeborn's eyes narrowed slightly as he absorbed her words. Then you must not go alone. I will, Galadriel said, her voice rising with a quiet certainty that left no room for debate. This is a journey I alone must take. The shadows call to me. I hear them, even in the silence of the forest. They speak in the voices of those we thought defeated. Celeborn's face softened, though his worry remained. He had stood by Galadriel's side through the long years of their reign, but he knew that when her mind was set, there was little to be done to dissuade her. She was resolute, as she had always been. Then, at least, let me send word to our scouts in a region. The ruins may hold some clue to this disturbance. Galadriel gave a single nod of gratitude. She knew the path would lead her to the east, to places where few dared to tread. But first, there were ancient memories to unearth. The shadows of Eregion had their own stories, dark ones, tied to the very heart of Sauron's deception. That night, Galadriel sat alone in her chamber, the flickering of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The phial of Erendel rested in her hands, its soft light pulsing faintly as though alive. She gazed into its depths, her mind far away. As she sat in meditation, a vision began to form. Faint at first, like the murmur of distant voices, but gradually, it grew clearer. She saw flames licking at the edges of a broken land, twisted and charred by a power ancient and malevolent. In the heart of this desolation, a figure moved, tall and shadowed, cloaked in darkness, but with eyes that burned like coals. Sauron. Yet, not as she remembered him. This was an echo, a memory of the being he once was. His form wavered, incomplete, but his malice, his hatred, remained. Galadriel. The voice came from the darkness, soft at first, but rising in power. It was a voice she had not heard in an age, yet it chilled her to the bone. The name Anatar came unbidden to her mind, the form Sauron had once taken, the fair face he wore when he deceived the elves of Eregion. Galadriel. You cannot hide from me. I am forever. The vision dissolved in a swirl of darkness, leaving Galadriel in silence once more. But the voice remained, echoing in her mind like a curse. She opened her eyes. The light of the phial had dimmed, but still, it pulsed faintly, as though battling against an unseen shadow. There was no doubt now. Sauron's presence still lingered. She rose from her seat and walked to the edge of her talon, looking out over Lothlórien. The night was quiet, but her mind was ablaze with the knowledge of what was to come. The peace they had fought so hard for was already crumbling at the edges. The shadow would rise again, in new and unexpected forms. The next morning, before the first light of dawn touched the treetops, Galadriel made her way through the silent woods. She wore a simple traveling cloak, its hood drawn up to conceal her face. Few would see her leave, and fewer still would understand why. This was a journey of necessity, not choice. The shadow called to her, and she could not ignore it. At the borders of Lothlórien, Galadriel paused. She looked back only once, her gaze lingering on the golden trees that had been her home for so long. A feeling of finality settled in her chest. The last days of Lothlórien were upon them, though none but she could see it. The world was changing, and she, too, must change with it. She turned her back on the woods and stepped beyond the borders of her realm, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. The east called, and Galadriel would answer. Darkness waits, she thought, as her footsteps carried her into the unknown. And I will meet it, no matter the cost. Chapter 2: The Blackened Paths of Eregion. The road to Eregion was long and worn with time. Few ventured to this forsaken land, for its once great cities now lay in ruin, haunted by the memory of a betrayal that shaped the fate of Middle-earth. The wind was harsh here, whispering through the broken stones as if the land itself mourned. Galadriel rode silently, her silver cloak blending with the pale light of dawn. The golden woods of Lothlórien were far behind her now, and with each passing mile, she felt the weight of her past grow heavier. Eregion had been a place of hope once. A land of elven smiths and artisans, where the finest works of the elves were forged under the guidance of Celebrimbor. But it was here that Anatar, the fair guise of Sauron, had entered their midst, offering his knowledge and seducing their hearts with promises of power. It was in this land that the rings of power were crafted, and the ruin of many began. The landscape around her was barren, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed reluctant to let the light through. As Galadriel rode through the desolate paths, she could sense the taint that lingered in the very air. Though centuries had passed, the land still bore the scars of that deception, and Sauron's malice lingered, twisted into the bones of the earth. She reined in her horse at the sight of the ruins of Ostinedhill, once the heart of Eregion. Now, the city lay in shadowed silence, its tall towers broken and its streets empty. Nothing moved, save for the wind and the faint rustle of debris. She dismounted, her hand resting briefly on the hilt of the dagger she carried, a relic from the First Age, though rarely used. Galadriel had no need for such weapons, her power lay in the wisdom and strength she had gained over the long years. But in these lands, caution was wise. As she walked through the crumbled remains of the city, memories surfaced unbidden. She had visited this place often in the Second Age, speaking with Celebrimbor and the other great smiths who had taken such pride in their work. Now, only shadows remained of that time, and the beauty of their craft was buried beneath the rubble. But there was something else here, something stirring beneath the surface. Galadriel's sharp senses could feel it, a faint pulse, as if the land itself remembered the treachery it had suffered. She came to a halt before what was once the great forge, where the rings had been made. The walls were blackened by fire, and the air seemed thicker, almost suffocating. Here, in this very place, Anatar had whispered his deceit, and the elves had been too eager to listen. Galadriel closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting back to those days when Sauron's influence had been subtle, hidden beneath layers of charm and beauty. Suddenly, a faint sound reached her ears. It was almost imperceptible, like the softest footfall on stone. Galadriel's eyes snapped open, and she turned, her hand tightening on the dagger's hilt. Her senses stretched out, searching the surrounding shadows. For a moment, all was still. Then, from the darkness of a nearby archway, a figure emerged. He was tall, his form cloaked in a gray, tattered garb that blended with the ruins. His face was worn, weathered by years of wandering, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He stopped several paces from her, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a sword strapped to his side. "Lady Galadriel," he said, his voice low and steady, yet with a hint of respect. "I did not expect to find the Lady of the Golden Wood in these forsaken lands." Galadriel studied him for a moment before responding. "And who are you, who walks these ruined streets?" The man bowed his head slightly. "I am called Thander, a ranger of the north, though I find myself wandering far from home." "Why have you come to Eregion, Thander?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. "Rumors," he replied, stepping closer. "There are whispers of dark things stirring in the east, and I sought to learn if those whispers held truth. The paths I have taken have led me here, though I suspect you have come for much the same reason." Galadriel nodded slowly, sensing no malice in him, though she remained wary. "There is something here," she said, turning her gaze back to the ruins. "An old shadow that refuses to fade. I have come to find its source." Thander's expression darkened. "I have seen things on the road, creatures that should not walk this world. The farther east I traveled, the more I felt it. It is as if the very earth has been poisoned." "Poisoned indeed," Galadriel murmured, her eyes narrowing as she gazed toward the distant mountains. "The power of Sauron was great, and though his body is gone, his will lingers. The land itself remembers his touch." Thander nodded. "I have seen strange things here, too, lights in the sky, sounds that have no source. This land is not as abandoned as it seems." Galadriel turned to him fully now. "There is a presence here. It has grown stronger since I entered these ruins. If we are to find the source, it lies deeper within." Together, they moved through the city, silent and alert. The wind had died down, and the stillness was unsettling. As they passed beneath an ancient archway, Galadriel felt a shift in the air. A coldness crept up her spine, and her mind reached out, sensing the shadow that lay hidden beneath the stones. There was something here, something tied to the dark history of the place. They reached the old forge, where the blackened remnants of the elven work still lay scattered. As they stepped closer, Galadriel felt it again, a faint tremor, a pulse in the air. She knelt by the remnants, her fingers brushing the stone. A coldness seeped into her skin, and for a brief moment, she saw it, a flash of the past. The forge ablaze with life, elven smiths at work, Celebrimbor at the helm, his eyes filled with pride as the rings took shape. And standing beside him, Annatar, his fair face a mask, hiding the malice that festered beneath. His voice was like honey, sweet and deceptive, and the elves, so eager for knowledge, had fallen under his spell. The vision faded, and Galadriel drew back her hand. "It was here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was here." Thandor, watching her carefully, stepped forward. "What did you see?" "Sauron, in the form of Annatar," she replied, standing. "He walked among these people, guiding their hands as they forged the rings. His corruption seeps into the very stones of this place." Thandor's hand tightened on his sword. "Then we must be cautious. If his presence lingers, there may be more than just memories haunting these ruins." They pressed on, moving deeper into the heart of the city. The air grew heavier, thick with an unseen malice. Galadriel could feel the darkness pressing in on her mind, and she knew that they were drawing closer to the source of the disturbance. At the edge of the ruins, they found it, a crack in the earth, wide and jagged, as though the land had split open under the weight of its sorrow. Faint whispers emanated from within, like voices carried on a distant wind. The air around the crack shimmered with an unnatural energy, and Galadriel felt her heart quicken. "This is it," she said softly. "Whatever remains of Sauron's malice is below." Thandor looked uneasy, but he nodded. "Then we must go down." Together, they descended into the crack, the air growing colder with each step. The darkness below was thick, oppressive, and Galadriel could feel the evil that pulsed beneath the earth. It was as though the very ground was infected, corrupted by Sauron's touch. The light of her file flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the stone walls. As they reached the bottom, Galadriel felt a presence, not Sauron himself, but a fragment of his will, something left behind to guard his secrets. A creature stepped from the shadows, its form twisted and unnatural, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. Galadriel drew herself up, her hand tightening around the file of Erendil. The creature hissed, its voice a broken whisper of the malice that had once driven armies to ruin. "Lady Galadriel," it croaked, "you should not have come." Chapter 3, The Haunting of Khazad-dûm. The path to Khazad-dûm wound through the darkened valleys beneath the shadow of the misty mountains. The jagged peaks loomed overhead, cloaked in mists that swirled like forgotten spirits from another age. It had been long since Galadriel had walked this road, and the memory of the once great dwarven city weighed heavily on her heart. She had seen it in its glory, the halls of stone gleaming with the fire of craft and toil. But now, its name was whispered only in fear and sorrow. Beside her, Thandor moved with the silent grace of a seasoned ranger, his eyes scanning the treacherous cliffs for any sign of movement. They had traveled for many days since leaving the forsaken ruins of Eregion, their pace swift yet cautious. The deeper they ventured into these lands, the more the shadow seemed to thicken around them. It was not the darkness of night that troubled them, but the unseen weight of ancient malice that clung to the air. "This land feels wrong," Thandor murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder might wake the ghosts that slumbered beneath the mountains. Galadriel nodded, her gaze fixed ahead. "There are echoes here, fragments of power, remnants of a time when the world was shaped by forces darker than Sauron. The deeper we go, the more we will feel them. They descended into the valley where the gates of Khazad-dûm once stood proud and tall. Now, the entrance yawned before them like the maw of some great, sleeping beast. Blackness lay beyond, a darkness deeper than night, untouched by the light of stars or moon. Thandor paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Are we certain this is the path? What remains in these halls? Galadriel turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. I sense it, deep within the earth. There is something here, a shard of the darkness we seek. It is ancient, older than the evil that has taken shape in our time. It is tied to Sauron, but it reaches further back. Thandor hesitated, then nodded. Then let us not delay. Whatever we seek, we must find it before it finds us. They stepped into the blackness of Moria, and the weight of the world seemed to close in around them. The air grew still, thick with the scent of dust and stone. Their footsteps echoed through the vast, empty halls, the sound magnified in the cavernous space. Galadriel's sharp eyes could see far beyond what any mortal might, but even here, in the depths of this forsaken place, the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. They moved in silence for what seemed like hours, the path winding deeper into the mountain. The grandeur of the ancient dwarven halls was still visible beneath the ruin, pillars carved with intricate runes, archways that reached high into the ceiling, all now covered in the dust of ages. But something else lingered in the air, something that set Galadriel's heart on edge. The whispers began faintly at first. Barely perceptible, like the sigh of wind through a long-forgotten tomb. But as they moved deeper, the voices grew louder, though still distant, as though they called from some far-off place, unreachable yet ever-present. Thandor stiffened, his hand on his sword hilt. "Do you hear them?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. Galadriel's expression darkened. "They are the shadows of the past, echoes of those who once dwelled here. Their voices linger, trapped between this world and the next." Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, a faint but unmistakable shudder that sent dust falling from the ceiling. Thandor drew his sword, the faint glimmer of its steel catching what little light there was. "There is something alive down here," he said, his voice barely above a breath. Galadriel stepped forward, her presence commanding despite the mounting darkness. "It is not alive, but it stirs. There is malice in the air, an ancient anger that has not yet faded." As if in answer, a low moan echoed through the chamber, rising from the depths. The sound was not of wind or earth shifting, but of something old and hungry, a presence that had slept too long and now awoke with the arrival of the intruders. They pressed on, each step taking them closer to the source of the disturbance. As they rounded a corner, they came upon a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. In the center of the room stood a towering pillar, cracked and broken, and at its base, something moved. It was spectral, its form flickering in and out of sight, as though it belonged to another world. Its face, once that of a proud dwarven lord, was now twisted with rage and pain. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and it moved with a grace that belied its broken, ethereal form. Thandor tensed, raising his sword. "What is that?" Galadriel stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she gazed upon the creature. "It is a shade, a remnant of the past. It is bound to this place, cursed to linger in the shadow of its own destruction. It was once a servant of Morgoth, twisted by his power and left behind when he fell." The shade turned its gaze toward them, its voice rising in a chilling wail. "You should not have come here." Thandor gripped his sword tighter. "Can we defeat it?" Galadriel raised her hand, and the light of the phial of Erendil flared to life, casting a pale glow through the chamber. The creature recoiled, its form flickering more violently as the light touched it. But it did not flee. "No," Galadriel said softly, her voice steady. "It is not a creature of flesh and blood. It cannot be killed by mortal hands. But it can be banished." She stepped forward, her hand outstretched, and began to speak in the ancient tongue of the elves, a language older than the world itself. Her voice was soft but carried with it the weight of ages, a power that resonated through the very stone of the chamber. The shade shrieked, its form trembling as the light of the fire grew brighter. It lashed out, its movements wild and desperate, but it could not touch her. With a final, echoing wail, it dissipated, fading into the shadows from which it had come. Silence fell over the chamber once more. Thander lowered his sword, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was that?" "A fragment of the old world," Galadriel said, her gaze lingering on the place where the shade had vanished. "It was once a servant of Morgoth, twisted and broken by his power. It has lingered here, feeding on the darkness that Sauron left behind." Thander sheathed his sword, his expression grim. "There may be more like it." "There are," Galadriel said, turning to him. "But this one held a piece of what we seek. The malice that Sauron left in these halls has grown, feeding on the anger and pain of those who perished here. It is not yet gone." Thander frowned, glancing around the chamber. "So what now? Do we go deeper?" Galadriel nodded. "The path continues beneath the mountain. There is something still hidden, something that Sauron left behind. We must find it before it awakens fully." Together, they moved toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow passage led deeper into the heart of Khazad-dûm. The darkness there was thick, impenetrable, and the whispers that had faded now began to rise once more, growing louder with each step. They descended further, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The stone walls seemed to close in around them, and Galadriel could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on her. The deeper they went, the more the presence of Sauron became tangible, a dark, malignant force that seeped into the very air they breathed. At last, they reached a vast cavern, its walls lined with jagged stones that seemed to glow faintly with an unnatural light. In the center of the cavern stood a monolith, a great black stone that pulsed with a dark energy. It was here that Sauron's will had anchored itself, a fragment of his malice left behind to fester in the deep places of the world. Galadriel stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the monolith. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the heart of the shadow." Thander moved to her side, his hand once again on his sword. "What must we do?" Galadriel did not answer immediately. She could feel the power radiating from the stone, a power that was older and deeper than anything she had faced before. This was not simply Sauron's malice, it was a remnant of the First Age, a power that had been buried beneath the earth when Morgoth was cast down. And now, it had begun to stir. "We must seal it," she said at last, her voice firm. "If this power is allowed to awaken, it will spread beyond these mountains, corrupting everything in its path. It will undo all that we have fought for." Thander nodded grimly. "Then let us begin." As they prepared to face the darkness, the air around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The shadows in the cavern began to shift, and from the corners of the room, spectral forms began to emerge, remnants of the past, drawn to the power of the monolith. Chapter 4: Sands of the Fallen. The air was dry and stifling as Galadriel and Thander crossed the threshold into the Southlands, a land once verdant but now stripped bare by time and war. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of shifting sands beneath a merciless sun. This place was far removed from the fertile lands of Middle-earth's north. Here, there was no shelter from the heat, no comfort in the earth, only a desolation as deep as the wounds that had been carved into this realm during the War of the Last Alliance. Galadriel felt it immediately, the pervasive presence of something darker than the mere absence of life. The very air seemed to thrum with a malice that was ancient, buried beneath the desert's expanse, waiting. "We are close," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind's low howl. Her senses, long attuned to the subtle shifts of power, could feel the shadow that lingered just out of reach. There was more here than the remnants of Sauron's defeated armies. Something older stirred beneath the sand. Thander, who had remained silent for much of the journey, nodded as he scanned the horizon. His keen eyes were fixed on a distant shape, barely discernible through the shimmering heat. "What is that?" he asked, his voice gruff, though there was a trace of unease behind it. Galadriel's gaze followed his, and she narrowed her eyes. It was a structure, weathered and half-buried in the sand. The remnants of a long-forgotten settlement, perhaps. She had heard rumors of such places. The Southlands were dotted with ruins of civilizations that had perished in the great wars of old, swallowed by the desert, their stories forgotten by all but the most ancient of beings. "We should go there," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The sands hide many things. There are answers waiting beneath that ruin." As they approached the structure, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the sound of distant voices, whispers carried across the desert like the memory of a forgotten song. The ruin stood stark against the pale sand, its once grand walls now crumbling and bleached white by centuries under the relentless sun. Strange markings adorned the stones, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as the light touched them. "This place is cursed," Thander said, his voice low. "I can feel it." Galadriel nodded. "It was not always so. These lands were once fertile, full of life. But when Sauron fled here after his defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, he brought ruin to all he touched. His malice lingers in the bones of this land, twisting it, warping it." They entered the ruin cautiously. The air inside was cooler, but it carried a heaviness, a sense of oppression that weighed down on them like a physical force. Galadriel could feel the presence now, stronger than ever. It was not Sauron, but something tied to him, something that had been left behind in the wake of his destruction. As they moved deeper into the structure, the whispers grew louder. It was not a language they could understand, but the tone was clear: pain, anguish, anger. The voices of the past, trapped here in this place. Suddenly, Thander stopped. "Look," he said, pointing to the floor. There, half buried in the dust and sand, was a sigil, a symbol that Galadriel recognized immediately. It was the mark of Sauron's forces, a twisted, jagged rune that had been carved into the stone long ago. "He was here," Thander whispered. "This was one of his strongholds." Galadriel knelt beside the sigil, her fingers brushing lightly against the worn edges. As her touch met the stone, she felt a surge of power, a cold, dark energy that shot through her like ice. It was a fragment of Sauron's will, a shard of his malice that had been left behind, like a scar on the world. She closed her eyes, focusing her thoughts. The shadows pressed in around her, and for a moment, she could see it, Sauron, his dark form towering above the armies that once marched across these sands, his voice a command that echoed through the very earth. He had fled here, to this desolate place, after his defeat, and though he had been broken, his hatred had rooted itself deep in the land. But there was something more. As the vision deepened, she felt the presence of another, a power older than Sauron, buried beneath the sands, waiting. It was hungry, a force that had been twisted and corrupted by Sauron's influence, but it had existed long before him. Galadriel opened her eyes, her breath shallow. "There is a great evil here," she said, standing slowly. "One that predates Sauron. He came here not to hide, but to awaken something, something that had been buried long ago. Thandor's face darkened. What could be more ancient than Sauron? Galadriel turned toward him, her gaze distant. There are forces in this world older than we know. The void from which Morgoth drew his power still lingers in the deep places of the earth. Sauron sought to control it, to bind it to his will. But now that he is gone, it festers, untethered. A sudden gust of wind swept through the ruin, carrying with it the sound of footsteps, though there was no one to be seen. Both Galadriel and Thandor tensed, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with unseen malice. "We are not alone," Thandor muttered, his voice tight. From the shadows of the ruin, figures began to emerge. They were twisted, spectral forms, their faces distorted with rage and pain. These were not living beings, but the remnants of those who had once served Sauron, their spirits bound to this place by the power he had wielded. The first of the shades lunged at them, its form flickering and unstable. Thandor drew his sword, but Galadriel was faster. She raised her hand, and the light of the phial of Erendel blazed to life, its glow piercing the shadows. The shades recoiled, hissing as the light touched them, but they did not flee. "They are bound to this place," Galadriel said, her voice steady. "They cannot leave, but neither can they rest. We must find the source of their torment." They fought their way through the ruin, the spectral shades swirling around them like a storm of despair. Galadriel's light held them at bay, but the deeper they went, the stronger the presence became. It was as though the land itself was rising against them, the very sand shifting beneath their feet, trying to pull them down. At last, they reached the heart of the ruin, a vast, open chamber, its walls lined with crumbling pillars and strange, ancient symbols. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on it lay a blackened relic, twisted and deformed. It pulsed with a dark energy, the same malice that Galadriel had felt since they had entered the Southlands. "This is it," she said softly. "The source of the shadow." Thandor stepped forward cautiously. "What is it?" Galadriel did not answer immediately. She could feel the power radiating from the relic, a power that was not Sauron's, but something far older. It was a fragment of the void, a piece of the darkness that Morgoth had drawn upon in the First Age, and it had been corrupted by Sauron's influence. "It is a vessel," she said at last. "A remnant of the ancient powers that Morgoth once sought to control. Sauron found it, and he tried to bend it to his will, but he could not. It has been left here, festering in the darkness." Thandor frowned. "Can it be destroyed?" Galadriel shook her head. "It is tied to the land now. To destroy it would bring ruin to the Southlands. But we can bind it, seal it away so that its power can no longer spread." She stepped toward the altar, her hand raised. The light of the phial shone brighter, casting long shadows across the room. The shades that had pursued them now hovered at the edges of the chamber, watching, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Galadriel began to speak in the ancient tongue of the elves, a language older than the stones of the ruin itself. Her voice echoed through the chamber, weaving a binding spell that would seal the relic away, locking its power deep within the earth. The ground trembled beneath her, but she did not falter. The relic pulsed one final time, and then, with a sharp crack, it was silenced. The air grew still, and the shades that had haunted the ruin vanished, their torment ended at last. Thandor sheathed his sword, breathing a sigh of relief. "It is done, then." Galadriel nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "The shadow has been bound, but it is not gone. It waits, as all dark things do, for the moment when it might rise again." They left the ruin in silence, the wind now a faint whisper across the sands. As they mounted their horses and rode away, Galadriel cast one final glance back at the Forsaken Land. The Southlands were no longer what they once were, but their darkness had been contained. For now. But in her heart, Galadriel knew that the ancient powers of the world could not be sealed away forever. They would rise again, as they always had. And when they did, she would be ready. Chapter 5, The Lost City of Galadhon. The wind had shifted. It carried with it a coldness that felt out of place in the desert sands of the Southlands, as though the air itself was whispering of forgotten things. The journey had been long, but Galadriel and Thandor now stood at the foot of the misty mountains, their jagged peaks towering above them like ancient sentinels. Hidden deep within the folds of these mountains was a city long thought lost to the world, Galadhon. Galadhon had once been a place of light and beauty, an elven city nestled high in the mountains, built in an age when hope still lingered in the hearts of the Eldar. But it had been abandoned centuries ago, and its name had faded into myth. Few, if any, still believed it existed. Yet, as Galadriel and Thandor ascended the rocky path that wound through the mountain pass, Galadriel knew in her heart that the city was there, shrouded in shadow, hidden from those who did not know where to look. "We are close," Galadriel said, her voice barely audible as they climbed higher. Thandor, his eyes scanning the path ahead, nodded grimly. "And yet, I feel no joy in finding this place. There is a darkness here, deeper than anything we have faced." Galadriel said nothing, but she felt it too. The air grew heavier with every step they took, as though the weight of centuries of sorrow pressed down upon them. The wind howled through the mountain peaks, carrying with it faint echoes, voices, perhaps, though whether they were real or imagined, she could not tell. They rounded a bend in the path, and at last, it came into view. Galadhon. The city stood before them, half buried in the mountainside, its once proud towers now little more than crumbling silhouettes against the sky. The light of the sun did not touch this place, and the shadows clung to every surface, casting a perpetual twilight over the ruins. The city was eerily silent, and yet Galadriel could sense the presence of something alive, a pulse of dark energy that radiated from the very stones. "There," Thandor said, pointing to the far end of the city. "That tower, it still stands." Indeed, one tower rose above the rest, though its spires were crooked, and its surface was marred by time. It seemed to draw the shadows to it, as though the darkness clung to it like a second skin. Galadriel's eyes narrowed. There was power there, but it was not the power of Sauron, it was something else, something older. "Galadhon was once a beacon of light," Galadriel said, her voice heavy with the weight of memory. "It was a place where the Noldor and the Sindar lived in harmony. But that light has been twisted. Something has taken root here, and it grows in the dark." They entered the city cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the stone streets. The ruins loomed around them, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift in the corners of their vision. Galadriel could feel the malice in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the city itself had been corrupted by the power that now dwelled within it. As they moved through the streets, they began to notice signs of life, strange markings carved into the walls, symbols that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Thandor paused before one such marking, his face twisted in confusion. "What do these symbols mean?" he asked, tracing the lines with his finger. Galadriel frowned. "They are not of elven origin. This is a darker script, one that has been twisted by shadow. These are marks of binding, rituals meant to tether the will of those who reside here to something greater." Thandor's expression darkened. A city enslaved. As they ventured deeper into the city, the air grew colder, and the sense of oppression became almost unbearable. The streets were empty, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. The faint whispers that had followed them since they entered the city grew louder, and Galadriel could feel the presence of something immense and ancient, lurking just beyond her sight. At last, they reached the base of the tower. Its doors, massive and wrought from blackened stone, stood slightly ajar, as though inviting them inside. Thander hesitated. "This feels wrong," he said, his voice low. Galadriel placed a hand on the door, her fingers brushing the cold surface. "It is wrong," she said. "But we must go inside. The answers lie within." They stepped through the doorway and into the darkness beyond. The tower's interior was vast, its walls lined with flickering torches that cast long, twisted shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of chanting echoed from the depths below. As they descended the spiral staircase, the chanting grew louder, and Galadriel's heart quickened. It was a ritual, a binding of wills, one that sought to enslave the minds of those who resided in the city. And at its center, she knew, was the one responsible for all of this, Rhuviel. Rhuviel had once been a lord of Galadhon, a proud elf of noble lineage. But something had twisted him, corrupted his heart and mind, and now he ruled this city from the shadows, binding its inhabitants to his will through dark rituals. Galadriel had heard whispers of him over the years, rumors that he had fallen into Sauron's influence long ago, though the full truth had never been known. Now, as they reached the bottom of the staircase, the full scope of his corruption became clear. The chamber they entered was vast, its walls lined with elves, their eyes blank and their bodies still as they stood in rigid formation. At the center of the room was an altar, and beside it stood Rhuviel, his once beautiful face now gaunt and twisted with shadow. His eyes glowed with a sickly light, and his hands moved in the air as he spoke the words of the ritual, his voice low and resonant. "Rhuviel," Galadriel called out, her voice echoing through the chamber. The chanting stopped, and Rhuviel turned slowly to face them. His eyes locked on Galadriel, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. But then, his face twisted into a sneer. "Galadriel," he hissed. "The Lady of Lothlórien, come to meddle in things she cannot understand." Galadriel stepped forward, her eyes blazing with light. "You have corrupted this place, Rhuviel. You have enslaved your own people, bound them to your will. This is not the way of the elves." Rhuviel laughed, a sound that echoed through the chamber like the rattling of bones. "The elves? These creatures are nothing more than tools. They serve me because they are weak, and I am strong. I have seen the truth, Galadriel. The light has failed us. There is only power now, and I will wield it as I see fit." Thander, his sword drawn, stepped beside Galadriel. "You have fallen far, Rhuviel. You are no longer the elf you once were." Rhuviel's smile widened, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "I have become more than an elf, Ranger. I have become something greater. And soon, I will be unstoppable." Galadriel's eyes narrowed. "You are nothing more than a servant of Sauron, Rhuviel. His power is gone, and yet you cling to the shadows he left behind. This city does not belong to you. It belongs to the people you have enslaved." Rhuviel's face darkened, and the air in the chamber seemed to grow heavier. "Sauron's power is not gone," he said, his voice rising. "It lives on, in me, in this city. And you will see it for yourself, Galadriel. You will see the truth." With a flick of his wrist, Rhuviel raised his hand, and the elves that stood in rigid formation around the chamber began to move. Their eyes glowed with the same sickly light that filled Rhuviel's, and they stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. "They are bound to me," Rhuviel said, his voice triumphant. "You cannot stop this. I am their master, and soon, I will be yours as well." Galadriel raised her hand, and the light of the phial of Erendel flared to life, its brilliance filling the chamber. The elves recoiled, their steps faltering as the light touched them, but Ruviel stood firm, his eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot defeat me, Galadriel," he snarled. "I have become one with the shadow." Galadriel stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with power. "You may have embraced the shadow, Ruviel, but the shadow does not love you. It consumes all who turn to it. And you are no exception." With a cry of rage, Ruviel raised his hands, and the chamber was filled with a howling wind, the air thick with dark energy. The elves moved forward again, their faces blank and emotionless as they closed in on Galadriel and Thander. But Galadriel did not waver. She raised the phial higher, and its light grew even brighter, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The elves faltered once more, their bodies trembling as they struggled against the bonds that held them. Thander leapt forward, his sword flashing as he struck down the elves nearest to him. But Galadriel's focus remained on Ruviel. She stepped toward him, her voice rising above the chaos. "This ends now, Ruviel. You will not enslave these people any longer." Ruviel snarled, his hands glowing with dark power. "You are a fool, Galadriel. You cannot defeat me." But Galadriel's power was older than Ruviel's, stronger and rooted in the light of the Vala. She spoke a word in the ancient tongue, and the light of the phial surged forward, enveloping Ruviel in its brilliance. With a final, echoing scream, Ruviel's form began to disintegrate, his body dissolving into shadow as the light consumed him. The dark energy that had filled the chamber vanished, and the elves who had been bound to his will collapsed to the ground, free at last. The chamber fell silent. The only sound was the faint flicker of the torches that still lined the walls. Thander sheathed his sword, his breathing heavy. "It is done," he said quietly. Galadriel lowered the phial, her face grim. "Ruviel is gone, but the shadow he served still lingers in this place. We must ensure that it does not rise again." As they left the tower, the wind stirred once more, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, the voices of those who had been freed, their spirits no longer bound by the dark power that had held them. But Galadriel knew that the darkness was not gone. It had only been pushed back, as it always had. And though Ruviel was defeated, the shadow of Sauron still cast a long and terrible shadow over Middle-earth. As Galadriel confronts the twisted leader of the lost city, Ruviel, she uncovers a far more ancient and terrifying force than even Sauron, one that traces back to the dark legacy of Morgoth. But the journey into the heart of the abyss has only begun. Will Galadriel's resolve withstand the madness lurking in the shadows beneath? Join us in the next episode as she descends deeper into the darkness, where every step blurs the line between light and shadow. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of the Shadows of Sauron.